Yeah.
So we should have them on.
Kia ora and welcome all to the Environmental Implementation Workshop on the future strategy and priorities for the Otago Regional Council Environmental Funding. Thank you, Mr. Malcolm, or Councillor Malcolm. I just want you all to go back and remember that in the long-term plan, we decided and agreed to put some funding into some environmental implementation, and on that basis it was a large scale, I think there's the wording on it. So what we're doing today is just working out the high level principles and strategy for how we expect that money to be used. We don't want to go too lower down into the detail, and in that we also have to consider that there's other funding that we have already existing, and you may decide, and that part of the discussion may be that we keep that in as continuity or we amalgamate this together. We have got far better brains than mine, on the other hand, to discuss this with. Olivia's got it with her, Emma and Marina. Kia ora. They have done some much better and cleverer thinking about how they think we can facilitate a conversation. The first part is just an overview of what we do now and should be familiar to all of us, but may not be. And then we're going to get into the details and the detail of how we may, of the principles. But we have got 3 hours for this, but it is really important that we get through to the principles rather than the detail, because we could lose ourselves quite easily going down. I don't want to say rabbit holes, because that would be just a $50,000 bundle of money, nothing else. Libby, when you've got, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. So I've got Emma here and Marina here, and they have been doing a whole lot of work behind the scenes for us, which is great to bring us all together to have a discussion about this funding and where we want to go.
Sorry, Kate, before you go.
Oh, so environmental implementation is within our resource centre under environmental implementation. We haven't got a multitude of folders in there, so there is only one folder, I think. It should be in there.
It's got the stuff that was sent out earlier on. Is it in that same folder?
There's 3 papers.
It's also on the invite, or in the invite.
Right, thank you.
Has everyone found them? You got it?
Two and I are on the same page.
That's all
Do you
right.
need a hand?
I'm gonna-
I can email them to you both.
Yeah.
Well, you click the link.
I think you just sent it to her.
I just emailed you, but I can see.
It's just been sent by email
Okay, there it
by
is.
Carly as well.
When you
Absolutely.
click on there, it
127.
doesn't click. Click on there.
The union's going to be very unimpressed with the CE doing the IT.
Sorry.
I'll just send you.
Does anyone else need them?
Email.
Just
Is that right? Yeah.
forwarding now, emailing.
I'll just summarise.
Thank you.
Let's go somewhere else.
Thanks.
Yep, that's right.
Paper for workshop 22. Print. Oh, there's another one coming. Right. Oh, thanks, Joe. So kind.
All right, is that good? Yes.
Thank you, that's good.
Anyone else need assistance from IT or anyone else? We're all good? Kevin would like some help too, Carly, I'm sorry. There should be an email you guys got.
Yeah.
Just covered all
It's
the
just-
email.
it's not-
I'm
yeah.
sending it now.
Apologies, guys, we are using Zoom tech, but it's always better to send this tonight before, Libby, you know that, but that wasn't able to be happened. No, it's all good. I think if you just carry on, they'll catch up,
Okay, cool.
please.
All right, so the purpose of today is to look at the purpose, allocation and structure of our existing environmental funding that's allocated by ORC. We also want to consider and discuss the future vision, strategy and environmental priorities for future investment in environmental programs and activity. We want to see if we can agree a high level approach to the purpose, design and implementation of future funding and priority investment areas. And the workshop is to help inform staff and consultants in the development of a detailed report and recommendations to guide decision-making around the investment structure, investment opportunities, and to note any unresolved issues or concerns that we need to address through this work.
Libby, can you just put the mic slightly closer to you? I'm sorry.
Sorry. Is that it?
Thank you.
So that's the purpose of today, and I'm gonna pass over to Emma now just to do an intro on her and Marina.
Kia ora koutou, ko Emma Hodgkin whakainga. Marina and I work for a company called Frequency. We have a Dunedin office which we established about 12 months ago. Marina's based in our Christchurch office as a graduate, and we have 3 of us in our Dunedin office. We primarily work in the horizontal and vertical infrastructure space from a project management perspective, but my background is a little bit of an anomaly for a lot of our 100 staff nationwide. My background's a lot more in public health and local and central government and procurement and funding and contracting. So pleasure to be here today and talk through this project. As Councillor Wilson indicated, we will sort of got two parts to the workshop. The first part really is just to set the contextual background, revisit a lot of the information you would have received in many reports in the past, but possibly in a different format. Tried to keep it sort of graphs and tables to visually represent some information that you can go back and look at later. We'll have a short break and then really use the second part of the workshop to focus on the discussion and debate, if you want, in terms of some of the future funding model, considering the existing structure and funding that's in place through direct mechanisms and contestable funding, and then also looking at the additional pot of funding that was signed off through the LTP and what that might look like. We have put in the agenda in terms of agreed actions and next steps and talking through so many unresolved issues. I suppose the disclaimer is, you've had a full morning already. There's a lot of information to digest, that it's not the end of the world if, from my perspective anyway, or Libby's, if we don't get to the point that you have a nice wee box with a ribbon on it of an agreed principles and structure going forward. So I'll just put that as a caveat to maybe reduce some pressure. So if we're going to look at sort of a snapshot of the current funding, bit of contextual from a high level is the current funding that's in place is there to support biodiversity, biosecurity and water quality outcomes. The funding through the Eco Fund's been in place since 2018, and over time the fund has changed, or new elements have been added with the incentive funding and large scale biodiversity funding, which was added in 2023 funding round. For this current financial year through your LTP, you approved an increased investment of $500,000 for that year, with then from 1 July next year, a $2 million increase to the existing funding that exists. Feedback through your LTP confirmed the other information that you received from council staff in terms of the need for the money going forward. And the definition of what was in the signed off through the LTP was large scale environmental projects. So part of the discussion today is, and you would have seen through the survey, was around defining what we mean by large scale and the interpretation of that. So through the LTP and through your annual planning processes, there's existing money there, and obviously the scope for increased money coming over the next 12 months.
So just to provide a little bit of context, we have had this influx of funding through Jobs for Nature, which was a $1.19 billion multi-agency program to benefit the environment and to create jobs as part of the government-wide COVID-19 recovery package. The project ended in 30 June 2024, and there have been some projects that have been extended past this date, but the stats on the website, on the Ministry for Environment's website, are that there's been $61.9 million invested into Otago through this program, which has supported 32 projects, which is to September 2023. And they provided 910 employment opportunities and funded 588,845 worker hours. Those projects have been supported by DOC, MFE, MPI, LINZ and Kānoa. And there's significant investment in a number of projects which are at risk by the loss of funding, such as the Te Wai Whakaata Restoration Program of $5.45 million in total funding that they received. So that's just to provide a little bit of context around what has been happening in the funding space and some, not all the rationale, but some of the rationale as to why we might like to invest more in these environmental incentive funding. So for the you happy for me to talk about this one? Okay. So for the current funding structure, so we've got, it's broken down into the two different areas, which are contestable and non-contestable funding. So the contestable funding includes the Eco Fund, although this funding is often grouped together with under the banner of Eco Funding, because we also sometimes include incentive funding alongside that. So the general Eco Fund was first allocated in September 2018 and has grown over the years from 88,000 in the first round to over 300k available in the 2023-24. The proposal for the allocation of the 24-25 funding is being presented to Council next month, so there'll be some opportunity to contribute to that next month. Over time, incentive funding has been added from April 2022, and then the large-scale biodiversity projects were added for the first time last year. So prior to the incentive funding, Eco Fund allocated grants based on over $5,000. So either a pool for over $5,000 or under $5,000. And then a number of arrangements are in place for direct funding as well. And some of these are one-off initiatives that have occurred annually, such as the Balance Environmental Farm Awards, which we fund on an annual basis. And there's some legacy arrangements and significant scale investments in activities across Otago, such as Otago catchment communities and the wild and conifer groups across Whakatipu, Central Otago and Upper Clutha, where we provide direct funding. And we will go provide some detail on that in some slides coming up. There's another circle on this slide as well, which is called other funding. And those are really just where we're receiving outside funding, so things from the national government, like our Toitū Te Hakapupu funding that we then give out to provide funding to landowners to achieve environmental outcomes. There's also the consent fee fund, and there are other ad hoc requests that we provide funding to.
The direct funding would be Lake Hazen, Tuakatoto.
Yes, so
That's a substantial number in the direct funding as well.
yeah, we provide direct funding for some organisations where we've so we also do that through our site-led biosecurity programs as well, and through like Tuakatoto funding, Otago South River Care and Tomahawk Lagoon with Eco Otago and the Snails Beach Care Trust. We fund them as well directly.
Sorry.
Just noticed the Balance Environmental Awards. I just couldn't remember. Do you recall like how much goes into that one?
Yes, we provide $20,000 to that one.
And some in kind.
Yeah, and in-kind support through judges and helping on the evening of the event.
Thanks, Libby. Just a little bit more detail on the breakdown of some of the contestable funding. This is the total funding as per the allocation last financial year. So as Libby alluded to, the banner of eco funding is often used, which includes the incentive funding and biodiversity funding, but just taking out the general eco fund grant. And this table sort of outlines what the maximum value was available. The maximum amount per project, not necessarily per year, because some were multi-year, able to be applied for multi-year projects. The scope of the investment and also a couple of notes there on the eligibility in terms of differentiating what individual landowners or collective groups of landowners could apply for, comparative to, say, charitable trusts or organisations. And you'll see there that the incentive funding pots are sort of $300,000, so similar to the general eco fund. So you've sort of got about a third allocation of the contestable funding across those areas. And this is just another wee table in terms of the showing what funds, the number of applications and the funds requested versus the funds available. And I think this is probably presented in the annual report, which Elodie would have prepared for council. And this is sort of a bit of a snapshot over time in terms of the oversubscribed of the different funds, noting that obviously there is within these some applications that were never approved, A, because the funding wasn't available, B, they didn't meet certain eligibility criteria as well, but sort of reinforces the feedback through the LTP process in terms of the demand versus the availability of funds, which I think if you've ever went to any organisation across any sector, they'd never say that they had way more money than need. So it's probably reasonably consistent. The next slides are just a few graphs which you can go through again at another time. But this graph shows really the number of applications that's been received over the past 6 years versus the number of projects that have been funded. So you'll see that at least, just to note through this, that 2 funding rounds a year did used to be held. So there is a couple of different cycles under some of the earlier financial years. So over the years, the percentages of projects receiving funding have been under about 50%. Except for March 2021, and as the standard with most graphs, COVID has had a large effect on results around funding and activities delivered in that period. So in terms of March 2023 round was the highest percentage of applications funded, which was at 65%. Some of that also might be due to it was the highest funding available as well, so more applications could be funded. This graph is around the changes in the levels of contestable funding requested and the funding that's allocated. So from the start of the contestable funding, the amount requested has always exceeded the amount available. And from 2018, the applications were 309%, with this peak to up to 524% in the January 2019. And again, demand dropped over those COVID kind of periods, as you would expect. This graph is sort of the changes in contestable allocation, and really this shows just the introduction of the incentive funding and also the large-scale biodiversity funding last year. So obviously early on, the Eco Fund General was the only funding pot available. That October 2019 drops to 0 because Elodie and I couldn't find the data on what was exactly available in that funding round. But you will see obviously a couple of sharp increases towards 2021, where there's been significant increase in the investment that ORC's made into environmental initiatives in the contestable space.
That was an election, which would make me think that October, they probably wouldn't have hit around.
So the date down the bottom is the funding round when the funds were allocated, not necessarily when the for the financial year. That's correct. Is that correct, Elodie? So just a question. So say that October 2020 round, that would have been when the applications came in, or would it have been in terms of the dates? Are those dates based on the funding round of when the applications were closed or when council resolutions were made? Just in
Sorry, there's one
general.
year, October 2019, and I just said that was an election,
election
was an
was, yeah.
unusual time to have giving out money.
Mm.
Yeah.
They did have around in October 2019.
You didn't?
Yes, they
Yeah.
did. They
Okay.
did, yes.
So those dates, Anna and Elodie, based on when council signed off the approval of funding, or when just the general period they would have applied for funding?
We'd have to double check. So I think it's the round that's open, but I haven't, this was before our time.
Yes.
But, yeah. The, it would have been similar time.
There's a lot of information on this graph, but really this is just a bit of a breakdown of the contestable funding versus where the investment goes in the non-contestable funding. So again, it's pretty much third, if you add up those 11% and the 5%, which is the different pots of incentive funding. In terms of the non-contestable funding, that's just a little bit of a breakdown of either the type of activity or the organisation that receives the funding. So you'll see from the contestable funding, significant portion there is going to the Otago catchment communities, and some possum control pilot, which is the organisation that's Predator Free Dunedin. And then there's a mixture of other things, and obviously that Balance Environmental Awards is in there is quite a small percentage wise of the funding. So overall, the allocation of contestable versus direct, you'll see at the top there, 56% of the current funding is going into direct funding and 44% into the contestable pots that are available. And the non-contestable funding shows that, sorry, that's something I've already mentioned, so don't need to repeat that. This is a bit of a snapshot from some great data that Alidi's collected around the EcoFund applications and recipients. And this is from the last round of funding, what was approved, the types of initiatives that were funded from the EcoFund General. And you'll see there that a reasonable amount has been still invested into the pest animal control and the pest plant control. The last one on the graph there was a project that looked at both, so I couldn't break that down by different amounts, but there's sort of a trend of 3 areas that it's largely the general eco funds are going into, and that's across a number of different types of organisations, from schools to charitable organisations and other trusts, both large and small, around the entire Otago region. And Alidi did have some data around the declined applications and the reasons for this as well, which is quite useful, I think, for the context in terms of why funding isn't approved or is declined. So in terms of the funding available, where's my note here? The overall ranking or score of assessment is 59%. So that's essentially where the approved based on the criteria, and then getting to a certain where the money runs out, basically, you know, if the top 10 ranked ones utilise all the fund, then 11th downwards.
So the 59 and the 12 are almost the same because they're both funding shortfalls, aren't they?
Essentially, sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. No, probably that blue one is where somebody has applied for, say, more than 50, the maximum they can apply for is 50,000, and they might have applied for 60,000.
I read that.
Yeah, so essentially what that's sort of saying is your majority of applications that are declined because there's not enough money in the pot. And so they haven't ranked high enough on the ranking score to be, say, top 10 or top 8 or whatever that can be funded with the money available. Then there's an element, obviously, that are asking for more money than they can, and then others that aren't meeting the criteria, or that they're asking for the wage, and that was a question we asked about in the survey. They're asking for more than 50%. This is just a wee slide that we took from the LTP feedback that Libby shared with us. And I won't go through this in detail, it just really reinforced the feedback from the community of where the need was, and which obviously then as a council decided to increase the investment. There's was also a survey done this year from the applicants and assessors as part of the EcoFund to get some feedback around how people are finding using the fund. Interestingly, 33% of the organisations applying were unregistered or unincorporated societies, and some of that might have been picked up by the private landowner stuff. Was it Alidi? Do you know? Did that include the incentive funding?
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah.
So that says unregistered or incorporated, is that unregistered or unincorporated?
Oh, yes, can you remember, Marina?
Sorry.
You did the,
It's like it wasn't a registered charity or.
so sorry, they'll be unincorporated and
Yeah.
unregistered, as part of that, so groups of landowners or individual landowners as well. Interestingly, nearly half of the applicants said that their projects couldn't proceed without the eco funding, which, you know, raises some of those questions later on around the sustainability of some projects and the length of time things get funded as well. So as part of the scope for the final report that will come to council, and we'll talk about that at the end, Libby has asked us to look at some other examples of environmental funding models which exist either nationally or internationally. We won't go into these in a lot of detail, but we just wanted to provide a quick snapshot of a couple of examples to keep in the back of your mind, and Marina and I've been looking at a lot of others which we'll be able to write in a lot more detail in the report that happen. But the couple that I suppose that we've picked, one local one from Australia is Waikato Regional Council, have a similar environmental funding model.
Is that from New Zealand, by any chance?
The New Zealand one. And they provide a similar structure in terms of how their environmental funding works to some small scale initiatives. They have a separate fund for small scale. They do essentially the equivalent of what the Eco General Fund is through their environmental initiatives. They do specify out their EnviroSkills program, which I know happens in the region, and Otago Regional Council was involved in that. They do have a separate scholarship available, and they do a specific direct and contestable fund around protecting natural heritage. And we have a table which sort of breaks down their level of investment. They've obviously, the small scale is little bits of money for under sort of $5,000, how the Eco Fund was initially set up, and that can be for individuals and small community groups. And for them, where the more formal entities and more established groups are leading bigger projects, obviously the investment is a little bit higher. With their environmental initiatives fund, which is probably quite similar to the Eco Fund, is similar to how yours is structured at the moment. Similar amount in terms of the total funding available, and your maximum allocation is 50,000, theirs is 40,000. And the scholarship is sort of a one-off, 1 year for a student. The other example is Environment Victoria, who have a similar breakdown of the different types of funds. When you see the table, don't be alarmed, because their funding is significantly higher, so it's not comparable from a level of investment context, but in terms of the community engagement and outcomes that they're wanting to achieve and the types of organisations they fund for the environmental outcomes is similar. And they also have a direct fund, which is a support and working in partnership with other local government agencies, which is quite interesting as well. And we'll have further details on this in a later report. But you'll see there, you know, one of their funds is 46 million, so it's not necessarily directly comparable. But some of their other grants are smaller amounts of money and smaller allocation pots as well.
Something to aspire to.
Something to aspire to. So we've actually gone through that quicker than what I thought we might. So we can have questions. If you'd like to take an earlier break, we can.
Okay, well, anyone with any questions? Andrew?
Sorry, I just want to go back a number of slides, and it just talked about, you know, the 60 odd projects in Otago or whatever, blah, blah, blah. Have we got analysis done for every dollar that the ORC contribute to whatever, whether it's Eco Fund or the existing funding and the other support funding mechanisms we have? Do we know what that actually generates from the contribution from the recipient of that funding, etc.? Do we know? Because that number is obviously significantly higher.
No, we don't. We haven't done that thorough analysis.
Okay, that's all right. Cool.
I've got one question if no one else has, and you know, it's nice seeing those figures in Australia. I was in Wellington last week and went into a Greater Wellington Regional Council reserve, And I'm not sure if anyone else does it the same way as Wellington does it, but the idea of them doing reserves as carbon, as environmental projects as well, because a whole lot of other things can then happen on that land, whether it be biodiversity, access and active transport and a whole lot of other things. I'm not saying that's the answer necessarily, but are there any other councils that do that sort of thing at the same level that they do it? No?
Well, Taranaki has a Taranaki Regional Park in the southern end of Taranaki, which
Okay.
is like,
And they're also hands-on doing stuff as well, sometimes as well, yeah.
And Auckland Council do
Mhm.
as well, they have
So
regional
different.
parks.
My gut feel is that it may be, and I don't have any scientific basis because we haven't done all of the work yet. But my gut feel is some of those unitary councils might find that easier, where they have that dual role of
Yeah.
regional council and either district or city council. My experience in Selwyn district, they are embarking on a regional park, 100-hectare regional park at the moment, which
With Canterbury or,
they're doing it from Selwyn as in
Yes.
terms of the land that they've owned for a significant
Yes.
period of time, but the community consultation on that has been that it's the community want that as a green space, open area with tracks and walking as opposed to sports fields and those types of activities. So I would suspect once they move into that process more, that will be more of a collaboration with Environment Canterbury in terms of some of those biodiversity outcomes, because they've got a very large piece of very, fertile, good land to be able to do a number of things on. So we can delve into that a little bit deeper, but
I know it's, I'm just interested, it's, sometimes it's, can we have? Okay, well, okay. I know that some do, and I just haven't really gone into, and we're possibly the one that doesn't. Thank you.
did you want to keep going? Did you want to take a break early?
I
Should
think
we-
don't let me go for a break. You saw how bad they were coming back this time. Sorry, seriously, just, can we carry on? Sorry.
no, right.
Yes, I have more questions if you've got.
Oh, just a quick question, just around incentive funding, and probably for Libby really. But can you just, because incentive funding is when we're incentivizing individuals.
Yes, we have one where we're incentivizing individuals, so we do that for our biodiversity,
Protected on protected private land.
on protected private land, biodiversity on protected private land, we do incentive funding.
Can I just say that's not technically incentivizing individuals, it's incentivizing
Do you want to come up to a
protected
microphone,
private
please?
land. So the group, generally,
Yeah.
Generally, the application comes from an individual because they own the land. It does not prevent necessarily a group applying to protect biodiversity on private land.
Is it a little bit like a QE2?
Yes, correct. So the
60
definition of protected is QE2 covenants or anything that's protected under some status of legislation such as a regional significant wetland or other protected aspects. So mostly it's QE2.
But generally our other
There's,
incentive funds are for community groups rather than for individuals, if that's what your question
there's
was.
a separate line for QE2 support funding, though, isn't there?
Yes,
Mm.
yeah, we do.
No, that's right, because that's what I got a bit confused when I was doing the survey with incentive funding. I wasn't too sure exactly.
Yeah.
What it was.
So congratulations, Lloyd, on doing it. Only 7 of us did. So congratulations and thank you all who have. We're about to move on to that. Andrew,
Would you allow me to ask a second question?
yes, indeed. Oh, I didn't realise you had another question.
Essentially a
Apologies.
bit of a school teacher role there just before, but anyway, I just wondered whether
No offence taken.
the value of having alignment with the principle, or not so much the principles, the criteria, with existing funding institutions, whoever they are. Has there been any thought about that? So then the ability for recipients of this funding, or if they're away getting funding somewhere else first, that there is some synergies. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah. Yeah, so in our forms, we have, we ask for people to put in their, what other funding they're receiving.
Yep.
But that's a good question, I think, probably for this group to think about is, how much do we want this fund to align with other funding streams? And is that something that we actually want, or do we want to have our own goals that we're looking to achieve and leverage other funding? And so I guess that's a question to think about.
Thank you. Anything else, Andrew, there?
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Any other questions? I think we can move on. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. So the second part of today really is to talk about the findings from the survey that we asked you to complete, and not everyone has done that, but that's okay. We've got some results, and to use that as an opportunity to have a discussion and debate if you wish, in terms of the next step forward. So I suppose I'll prefix the start of the session by, the survey wasn't perfect. It was purposefully, in some ways, some questions designed to trip your thinking and whether you were going to contradict yourself later in the survey. From a technology perspective, it wasn't perfect. I know some of you tried to and would have liked to rank things of equal value. You wanted to put a 3 when there was no 3. You had to do 1, 2. You had to either disagree or agree. You couldn't go in the middle. So we are aware of that. It's not perfect, but really what the purpose behind it was, talking with Libby about what we wanted to get out of today, is it's a starting point. When you're asked to do something anonymously and individually as a group of governors, it's easy for your own opinions to rise to the surface, and when you then compare all of your individual opinions together, it's quite interesting to see where there is a level of alignment in your individual opinion and where there might be misalignment, and then going forward as a council, what are those things you need to discuss and agree on to receive alignment to your strategic goals that you're looking to achieve. That helps inform where you want to go forward from here. So it is in a raw form. There were some very high level questions. There were some very specific questions. There is some areas of alignment. There is a number of areas of misalignment, and but it's an opportunity to discuss, because you fill out something like that in the context at which you fill it out at that point in time, and once you discuss with others, you might realise that you didn't answer the way you thought you meant to, or actually your viewpoint has changed. So we may not.
Can I just ask one question? Only because we have other parties that join us around council for Eco Fund and things. We didn't ask Marapiro reps of any sort, did we, to participate in this?
No, we didn't. They didn't do the survey, but we'll be meeting with them individually outside of this.
Okay, I just thank you. Sorry.
And there's opportunities through this process and the scope that Libby's given us for some significant stakeholder engagement. This is sort of, I suppose, the first cab of the rank to test some of the thinking at a high level. It's also not set in stone, so what you put in the survey doesn't become your strategy. If anyone was concerned about that, it'll still be a starting point. I also, like I said earlier, we may get through this discussion and you have clarity around what you do and don't want, but you may not as well. And if there are elements that we need to go back and think about and flesh out a little bit further, then that's okay too. We can do that. So just a quick slide. This was the different areas in the survey that we were asking around the strategic priorities and the vision for environmental funding, around the size and scale of initiatives that we should do in the future and the type of funding, using some examples of current eligibility criteria and funding that's designed, and then looking at how it could be delivered. And then the last bit was sort of starting that discussion around, defining what large scale investment is and what that might look like. And again, that's not really perfect either. So in terms of the funding domains, which is the areas of funding, so that was asking you to rank what you thought was the most important to the least important, given that your current environmental funding is around biodiversity, biosecurity, and water quality. And we threw in a few others there in terms of testing your thoughts. Now, the table on the right shows the range of responses, and what the survey gives us is obviously that kind of a cumulative average. So biodiversity came out on top, and in general, everybody rated, who completed the survey rated that first or second. Water quality similar. Once we start going down the list, somebody had biosecurity as second importance and somebody had it as seventh. Probably what came through unanimously was that transport was probably not for this type of funding, and that's okay. It's currently probably funded by elsewhere in council. And there was a few others which it's ranked, but it also didn't spit out for us very easily what those other things were. So this is sort of an opportunity to have a discussion around.
You know, I don't know if this is the time to ask, and this is a question I did ask Libby the other day, but it's the difference between biodiversity and biosecurity are often,
Misunderstood.
well, they're very aligned.
Mm.
Killing a possum is one thing, planting the food source for a bird is both sides of the same coin if you're trying to protect the bird,
Yeah.
or the lizard or whatever. And so for the purposes of this, have we got really clear definitions on what projects would equal biosecurity? Because if it's biosecurity and lack of recycling or something like that, it would possibly move, and it's mindset for me than some other biosecurity.
We haven't got clear definitions of what those are, other than how they're defined, and the work that we do. So you're right, that biosecurity outcomes can also, biosecurity activities can also have biodiversity outcomes, but in some instances they won't.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know whether that's a useful, maybe that's a question for the table, is whether that's a useful thing for us to look at how we define those. I think from managing the biosecurity team, I have the responsibility to deliver both biodiversity and biosecurity outcomes through biosecurity. So it's not easy to pull them apart and say this is just a biosecurity outcome and a biodiversity outcome all of the time, but sometimes it is, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and that's fine. I just wanted to raise it. I can't, again, because we couldn't go back on this survey, because you sort of went down the tunnel. Once you locked this in, it was hard to then unlock some of that brains. Yeah. Sorry, Andrew.
Just on that topic, potentially you could create an incentive where you overlapped, because you could argue the first three, you could overlap, or the first four, you could overlap a project. So there could be some sort of mechanism in the regime or the criteria where more is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe if you have a specific outcome you want to achieve, that's a biosecurity one, you would want that targeted to that. So that's what we need to figure out as a group.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Emma.
No, that's right. And obviously something like climate change is similar, because it's so broad in a sense. You know, you could potentially argue that anything is improving climate outcomes as well. What I've sort of done is each of the results put a slide after it with sort of some prompting discussion questions based on what the results showed, which, you know, we don't have to go through those each question by each question, but it'd be useful to have an open discussion in terms of some of the things that showed from each of the questions, to either, you know, flesh it out further or work out what those must-dos or the next steps are through that point. So I suppose some of the points that came up looking at that question is, you know, why did people rank them the way they did? And some of that might be, like you say, Councillor Wilson, in terms of your interpretation of the definition, whether you wanted to rank things equally, but it wouldn't let you do it. And I know there was one person who sent me a paper survey that did do that. And, you know, and what do we need to, I suppose, discuss or agree or understand better before you can make a decision around what those priority areas might be for your funding. And you know, and I think you've probably already alluded to why there might be a difference of scale of answers around something like biosecurity in terms of people's interpretation. And then are there other areas that weren't listed that you've thought of? So I mean, that's not an exhaustive list of questions, but that's some of the things from looking at the results for that area that are probably worth discussing or fleshing out.
For those who were frustrated filling in this online and making it easier for Emma and Marina, does anyone want to make some comments about their way they ranked it in light of that? Ellie?
Wasn't frustrated with the survey or anything, but perfectly fine, but I just wanna, qualify some of my, so with biosecurity, I sort of had the mindset of, possum control, for example, might be considered a biosecurity activity, but if they're applying for the Eco Fund to do that, they'll be doing that because of the biodiversity impacts rather than the biosecurity impacts. And so like biosecurity could be one of the many co-benefits we get out of this funding, but I would want to see the funding particularly for biodiversity, but a lot of the best ways to get better biodiversity are through measures that also benefit biosecurity. And then for my other one, in case you weren't able to read what they said, I just put something in there. I just get the survey sent back to me, so I'm trying to find the exact wording, but it was just something about Hikakai and other mana whenua values and stuff like that.
Thank you. Ellen?
Yes, many of these are so closely connected that I don't see that it's necessary to separate or define them. I think my idea of, when I filled out this, my overall idea of how I saw that fund would be used would be about protecting and enhancing the natural environment right here, here in Otago. And I suppose that's why I came up with the highest ones around air, water, biodiversity and biosecurity, thinking that's the environmental protection right here. And though I have nothing against measures to mitigation around climate change, I saw that as lower because it's not I saw the direct environment here is where I saw this fund could go.
Thank you, Ellen. Any other contributions and clarification, Lloyd?
Yeah, I'm happy you just copy my ones down. But I was wondering because others sort of ranked sort of a wee bit higher. I was wondering what was put in other for it to get ranked number 3 from the bottom. Was there suggestions put in?
No, people had ranked other, but then we couldn't see what they'd listed, so
I put other, but there wasn't anywhere in the next question to put other.
no, it did, we had a little glitch with
Okay.
so if there was other things that you'd like to share now is.
But mine it doesn't necessarily come under this, although I don't know where else we'll get a lot of money in. Mine is septic tank renewals. It is in the same way as Cozy Homes end up with new fires and new fires go into air environment. We don't have a fund that we can find out there are issues with septic tanks, but they are $40,000 improvements often to houses, and they have a huge effect. I know that iwi are very concerned about that around the Targi River and around
North Coast.
So just a note that we are looking at that separately with Nick as an opportunity through the annual plan to create a fund outside of this.
Yeah.
Brilliant, that's good. So it is cost neutral and that's great. So I wasn't sure at that time and so I just put it in there. Yeah, thank you. Lloyd and then.
Oh yeah, I'll just kind of finish off saying just like what everyone else has been saying, the top 4 pretty much all interlinked with each other. So it's really, at the end of the day, that's sort of where a pretty clear indication where the key spots are.
Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, mine was a late one sent in.
This is not a confessional.
It was sent in, and I didn't go to script, and I ranked them all the same, except for transport, because I think we're dealing with transport anyway, and that will come. But and why I ranked them all the same, so with this fund, I'm more interested in projects that have good environmental outcomes as opposed to pushing them into a specific category. And as the rest have said, I think most of those are all intertwined anyway. So if we're having one effect somewhere, it should, and I'm probably looking for projects that are good quality projects as opposed to they have to be in biodiversity because we've ranked biodiversity strongest.
Thank you. Any other comments? Any other confessions?
Yeah, this is pretty much how I ranked it as well. Biodiversity to me is restoration of natural habitats, protection of endangered species, that whole raft. So that's why I got it first. The rest of it's pretty much in the order that I put it.
And I think it raises an interesting point as we go through, and as Libby and I have talked, the funding that's currently allocated there's not a strong evaluation criteria necessarily. Some of it's quite small amounts of money. It's very difficult, as with anything that's long-term or potential behaviour change, how you would measure the impact. So it's part of this of asking you to rank things is to flesh out the conversation of, is this the important part, or is the impact and the outcomes the important part as well? So, which some alluded to in their responses. In terms of the 5 and 10-year vision, this was really to flesh out, I suppose, your own personal vision for where you wanted the fund to be, or the environmental outcomes in the medium to sort of longer term. This is just a little bit of a word cloud of some of the words that came up over and over. A lot of the consistent things were around community action, empowering communities, projects that have raised awareness or that have a significant environmental impact or contribute to outcomes. There was quite a bit of narrative in some of these, a lot of ideas around specific initiatives or projects, as opposed to sort of, I suppose, that big vision or goal that you were looking to get to as a council. So I suppose it's how you take some of the words and phrases from individual sort of view around, supporting catchment groups, or, people make comments about we want to support catchment groups or continue to invest in small projects. How do you take some of that operational delivery input output stuff that you're doing and translate that into a vision of what you want the fund to achieve? Because $4 million is really what we're looking at from next year. It's not a small amount of money. It's small comparative to Victoria, but it's not small in the context of Otago. So
population-wise, it may not be that much different.
Yeah, on a per capita basis. So through the 10-year vision, a lot of the things that came out were what has come through the last question around looking at those biodiversity outcomes and preservation of the environment, enhancement, stopping future degradation of the environmental assets. So really it's about, there's not really an answer for this one, there's no right answer, but I suppose it's to highlight that there was a lot of words and thoughts around this, and how you then condense it to be something that's really clear and measurable for future investment of what you're trying to achieve. Because obviously the structure of how you fund and the choices you make about what you fund will have a significant impact in terms of the clarity of the vision and guidance that you provide in that as well. So is there any discussion that anybody wanted to have? This was sort of the discussion questions that I had. Was really whether you think as a council you have a united or agreed vision of what you want the environmental funding to achieve, and if you don't resoundingly have that, how do you think you differ? Do you know the impacts or the outcomes that you want to achieve from the funding to be able to clearly articulate that, or give the staff guidance in what their terms of how they implement the vision? And if, I suppose I always ask, what's your pitch if somebody asked you what it was?
Yeah, just on that one, we definitely consulted on the long-term plan, and that's why I think we have to remember that it was a large-scale fund, that we go back to that, because I think once you put money out there, everyone can find a large-scale project, but we should be fundamentally looking back at those documents we did then, where I think we had a pretty united voice when we first set it up. Yeah. Ellen.
I think from those, looking at those 2 word cloud things you put up there, it's what stood out from just glancing at that is that one, environmental, if you like, that actually we want to see these, all those biodiversity, biosecurity, water quality improvements there. And the previous one was stuff about community and empowerment, wasn't it? So I think those are 2 different, related but different things, and those are the 2 bits that would stand out for me. And we're not just talking about the large scale fund here, we're talking about the whole $4 million, and so it could be that different parts of that have different emphases on those 2 goals.
Elliot.
Sort of lost my train of thought, but I think the vision I have popped down was with well-funded community-led protection and restoration of Indigenous ecosystems keeps high, which I think when pretty much what we've got in our visions and stuff anyways. But I'm sort of, I'm keen to, I don't have too many opinions currently on how much money should be going into which pool and what the incentives we should be trying to do. Because I feel like I'd much rather leave that to the people with expertise in that area as to what money going where is going to give us the best outcomes for that biodiversity stuff. So I don't even know if I'd much rather that just be a decision for the expertise, but I would just like us to maybe within those funding arrangements support those groups more and help them, you know, with whether that's with our resources or expertise or stuff as a council to if they've got a plan. Well, I know we mark people on best practice in the Eco Fund, but I feel like we could be looking at their plans and saying, hey, if you went about it this way, you might actually get even more progress on those outcomes you're trying to do for this specific area, and that kind of stuff. I feel like we can look at the area and know as a we hold the information on like what are the protected species there and what are the values there that we want to do. And I noticed in the Eco Fund, a lot of people ticked, we've got this specific protected and rare ecosystem, or they didn't tick it, and I knew based on just where it was that wasn't actually the case or whatever. And I feel like we should just be doing that part in-house. I don't know.
So from that, are you sort of implying in terms of, I suppose it's that process at the moment where the communities are self-identifying a project and coming to council and asking for the money to support it, as opposed to potentially a fundamental shift where council is saying, we know these are the priorities, we know these are the risks, we know these are the areas where we can have value for money or impact investment. So these are the types of things we're looking to fund, now apply.
I think there's maybe part of that, and our direct funding stuff has sort of created a bit of that. But even with the contestable stuff, which I'd still like to see, community led and then just the areas that they're keen to get stuck in working, but just have us available. I say council available to help them with how they're going to go about that. Even if it's like how far away you're planting the plants away from each other and that kind of level of detail. Because if we just give them money and then they go about it in a way that maybe could have been a lot better, I feel like there's a missed opportunity there, and we hold that knowledge. Or at least I think we would to help them. And just create less work for them in the application process and stuff as well.
So at the moment, we do some of that if we have enough. We receive the query early enough in the application process, we can help them mould it to be the best outcome. And we've got catchment advisors that can give advice on specific things that are within their knowledge base. So there's a little bit of that we can do. And we do get a bit restricted by the timeframes that the applications need to come in. And there's also sometimes a little bit of pushback from communities where we try and give them information that's kind of outside of this. It's a fine balance, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and getting them and giving them that information and moulding the project to be something that then almost looks like it becomes an ORC project. So there's a fine balance in doing that, but I think you're right. There's an opportunity as long as we have enough time to do that before the application's closed, because if we're going back and forth after that, it becomes really tricky on meeting those time frames for getting the funding out. But in the larger scale, within this project though, we could look at how we might be able to do that. Maybe we close them earlier and have a longer time for assessment. I'm not sure. I guess it's a question for everyone. Is that what we want to do? because we can do it. It just means we'd have to change kind of what our processes are now. Yeah. I don't know if that helps or makes it more confusing.
Thanks, Andrew and then Kevin.
I'm a great believer in pairing the communities, because I think that if we are able to give that little bit of a leg up and allow them to do the mahi and all the rest of it, I just believe that it's always going to be a better bang for our bucks, because they're not operating in a local government regime. So they're going to be a lot more efficient from a administration point of view and everything else. So pairing communities absolutely critical, and I think for the longevity of environmental benefits, and I agree pretty much with what Alan has said. Focus on those priorities and ensure that we give the tools that the communities need or individuals need to empower them just to get on with this work, because they know if they know a really good project and it gets through the criteria, meets all the various regs or rules or whatever, and then just allow them to get on with the job and have a relatively simple reporting regime where you can just send in some photos and a quick little comment about how things are going. Keep it simple.
Thank you, Kevin.
What I am struggling with, and I stopped and had a good chat with Brian just down the street there, because Brian was one of the first ones to actually push this concept of a large scale fund. And as he was reminding me that the initial thought was around where can we actually fund and support some of these big projects that are happening. And he mentioned the Southern Sanctuaries and what was the other one? He did say one, and the Halo projects that are big. And that's what I thought we were sort of more looking at the bigger end where we can hit things, because if we're going down into the minutiae of doing another $150,000 ones for an extension of the Eco Fund, that's a whole different scenario, which will create, and whether we get the best bang for buck, I'm just not sure. So if we really need to be, if that's where we want to be, and that's what I thought it was about helping these big projects that are possibly underway or possibly trying to get underway, how we best approach them. So and I suppose we have to get some agreement if that's where we're actually heading first.
That is the whole purpose of today, and it's either it's a 2 million or it's a 4 million fund. So they're two separate funds at the moment. So this is large scale and there is the existing funding, or we look at them together, and that's sort of where we're going to be going. But I think they're all valid parts of the survey and coming out.
So, well, can I just go back to end on your funding to put some of it in reality? So if we're talking about a $2 million fund, if you look at the Waikato one, which is just on, so they put just on $2 million in, but their population's about 550,000. So do you know where they get their money from? Is it all rate driven?
We for today's workshop, we haven't gone to the level of detail, but when for the final report, we'll have some more detailed analysis.
Yeah, and the same with the Victoria one. I bet you there's the odd mine or something that's actually throwing some
probably,
funds
and
into
it could be federal government.
Yes, it could be offsetting.
Yeah, because they're $81 million on a 7 million population, which is, I just sort of, we've got to be actually real. Because ours at 2 million is actually $8 a head. I know you might not want to get into that, whereas Waikato, which seems they're flying, but that's only $3 a head, so $3.50 a head. So you've got to look at what we're doing and
He's co-chair of finance for a reason.
Well, it's that's what we're actually looking at, and so and I just wonder if we're losing the track of actually hitting those big things that are actually functioning there and making sure they do, because we're not going to replace the $61 million that were put in to get everything going. So I'm just sort of struggling with where we're.
Yep, that will valid.
Mine was actually quite similar. And I think Alan's done a think piece on this before too, in an email to us around a wee while ago around the synergies and the benefits you get from investing in the bigger projects, that do what Elliot was talking about actually. So it doesn't need to necessarily be our council, but we can feed in our technical info. Oh, sorry, technical info. So I guess it's our whole catchment approach and community driven thing going forward as well, where we identify the things in spatial areas that make that are most important, I suppose, to community, that are existing already, the things we care about, and we get behind protecting and enhancing those. But they call it in funding death by 1,000 projects when you fund a whole heap of small ones, and then every year, because you don't usually refund over and over and over again those small ones, they don't get bigger. They go away, and then you come up with another 1,000 of them, and nobody helps them or supports them or directs them and all that stuff. Whereas exactly what Kevin was saying about projects like Predator-Free Dunedin or Southern Lakes Sanctuary, or it's probably in the Catlins going forward too as part of the catchment work we're doing. They're supported, they're directed to the places where they can have the most bang for buck, and it's enduring funding that can actually make a difference. I think we're all saying the same thing on that. Yeah.
But the word I had brought up, what maybe I hadn't, was landscape scale and or catchment scale, rather than catchment, it was catchment scale type activities. And I thank you for that comment about Predator-Free Dunedin. That was actually 28 groups that bidded together. And so they got rid of a whole lot of administrative costs by working together. And I think that's what I like about large scale. It gets rid of some of the and the fact that you can do it at that scale and you can work, it gives you much better buy-in to the whole community. It's not about the individuals and people, then it needs some really good coordination, but it's your wins are so much greater, which is or generally they are. Yeah. Sorry, Lloyd.
You know, I pretty much agree with what you've just been saying. I do think it's important that we still have some of the smaller funding available for the smaller groups and startup groups, the virus schools, that sort of stuff, the get it out into the public stuff. But then I think we got to be really careful we don't have double ups on the way through as well. So we got, even like currently now there's different areas within our own organisation that are funding similar things like, like we fund OCC, fund little projects, and you've got QE2 stuff that's funding a bit of fencing here and there, and you've got a bit of stuff over there. So I think we just need to get it all rationalised down into manageable units. But I think at the end of the day, the whole idea behind the 2 million was to be doing to support that landscape style, or Ki Tai type stuff. But I do believe I do think I'm very much a big fan of empowering the communities to do it, because you get the synergies and the value adds from that. Other funds that they'll draw in as well. So it's your southern, exactly what these ones will be saying, your Southern Lakes Sanctuaries, your Predator-Free Dunedins, if there's a big biodiversity group, somebody sets up a site-led project, specific stuff where they need to have security of funding for more. You got the wee stuff for 1 year stuff where you need, this is like the 3, 5, 10 year ongoing funding that we can help, but it's more like to help them to gear up on us. Does that make sense? That's why I see it, because we got to make sure we use this money not as it's not just our money, we want to get this money attracting other money as well.
Thank you.
Or other inputs.
Yeah. I think so you had a comment to make.
Oh no, I think Lloyd just summarised it quite well. It's important when we start talking about how to use the 2 million, which was targeted at large scale. That was the whole discussion through the long-term plan in terms of filling some of the void, not all of it, that we understand for context what we're already doing, which is where the slides to date have been focusing on, because it's that will still remain a large part of what we do. And so it's important to have that context in your head when you're giving direction around how you may want to set up this future fund, which was tagged for something slightly different. Still similar outcomes, but managed in a slightly different way because its purpose was slightly different. So what I'm hearing is everyone's largely on a similar page in terms of what the purpose of that $2 million per annum fund was. I think we know as staff, and we'd had instructions previously through different meetings, that there is some rationalisation and simplifying of process and improvements that can be made to the small scale stuff. And I know Libby and the team are already working on that. But I think what I'm hearing anyway is that, subject to still some further discussion and some work to do, there's a fair understanding of how we might use this new fund to support larger scale, longer term seed funding initiatives that will make a big difference across multiple areas.
Thank you. I think that's everyone who says say too, then we're on to the results.
Great. So the next section, I think we'll probably take a break after we go through the next ones, was sort of a range of statements around your level of agreement with a number of elements. And I suppose the other context here is it was asking things that are about the existing funding as well. So it wasn't just assuming that $2 million pot, that if you were looking at the funding as a whole, what are some of the things that are important or that you agree with? And it was to test some of those thoughts, like the discussion we've just had is, how important are the community-based initiatives that are feel good and nice to have, that help rally the community, in comparison to investing in some large scale projects which may either have a high cost and or a high environmental impact and or might require some significant long-term investment. So just going to run through the statements and just show you where the average sat on the line of people's thoughts overall. And then at the end of that, just sort of got a summary of those areas where there was reasonable alignment or not, or differing views. And again, that might have been from the context that people interpreted the questions. So sort of an obvious one we asked linked to the strategy was, should what you fund, your environmental funding, be used for aligned to your priorities and strategic direction? Pretty much everyone strongly agreed, or everyone agreed or strongly agreed with that, that you should be funding what's in line with your strategy. The second question was around whether you wanted to fund whether your investment in community-based initiatives was more important than looking at things with environmental impact. And there was a range of answers here, but essentially about 80% of you disagreed, implying that your contribution to environmental outcomes is more important than the community feel-good aspect.
Or possibly that they could go together and you don't have to prioritise one over the other.
Yeah.
Because I think that's significant too in what the discussions we've been having.
Yeah. And it's difficult because looking at the small or the big money-wise versus the small organisations, the large and the long-term and the short investment is, it's quite a lot of trade-offs to make with one pot of money, which isn't always easy to do either. So this question was around the sort of the level of comfort, I guess, or risk appetite for some of those longer term, larger scale, potentially higher risk investments, depending on what the projects would be. And again, most people came out there with 60% strongly disagreed with the statement, which reinforced the support of some of those earlier questions as well, that larger scale investment. The question around the role of the council in funding long-term environmental programs over those discrete one-off projects. The results to this one were really quite mixed, and I think everybody there was a vote from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and 40% disagreed and 60% agreed. So it sort of has come out in the middle, and that's something we will talk about in more detail. This was a question in terms of testing equality of funding across the region versus equity of funding, or where environmental need was, and most were in strong agreement that it should be on a need basis as opposed to by geographical region. In terms of the current fund criteria, there is an element of salary or wage costs that people can apply to up to 50% of the cost of a project. And this was really looking at not necessarily a discrete future pot of 2 million, but if you were taking into account the criteria of the whole funding and how it's currently used and the things that it's currently used to support. Around the future appropriateness, I guess, of supporting salary costs. There was mixed results in this one as well, with answers across the whole spectrum. And again, from a contextual perspective, probably how people voted on this, there's an element of, program sustainability that comes with funding salaries. And if after, say, up to 3 years, which is current criteria, other funding sources haven't been sought, what happens to the program or the initiative then? The question around whether it was a hand up or a handout, sort of implied, and whether everybody assumed it this way, was that seed funding sort of concept of to get projects or programs up and running, which would then find other funding sources or become financially sustainable on their own. And there were some mixed results to this as well, but in large, most people was a level of agreement that this was to start people off or kick things off, rather than ORC carrying the cost in the longer term. And looking at the future investment around private land and the investment on private land, there was agreement that we should enhance the outcomes, environmental outcomes on private land. But you'll see when we get into some of the questions later around who should get funding, private landowners didn't come high on the priority list. So there might be a bit different there in terms of maybe protecting the private land, but whose job that is, or whose role that is a question potentially as well. Looking at other funding pots, potentially such as scholarships or action-based research or evaluation, there was some differing levels of opinion here, and potentially may have been how people interpreted the question, or there was no context of a certain amount of money that would look like, or who would do that. So some differing opinions there as well. And in terms of the level of accountability that council receives, that was really asking, and I know a couple struggled with the interpretation of the question, was really asking in terms of the information you get back from those who have received funding, and appreciate that it may be at a staff level that a lot of information is given. As a councillor, are you happy that there's an element of value for money for the spend that you're already making, or from the accountability documentation that you get, noting that obviously some projects are quite small investment for a small period of time, but there is potential in the future that you could be investing in some quite significant projects that may have higher costs, higher risk, and how the importance of the return, I guess, on that from a value for money impact perspective. So those were essentially the sort of testing of some agreement statements of where individuals fell on the scale. And there's one in the paper survey who tried to fool me by just putting the middle and was asked to redo it. But that might have been, again, my misinterpretation of where the placement of the pen was.
I'll please everybody.
Fence sitter.
So taking all of those sort of statements and looking at the results, because obviously from the data that we get, we could see across the spectrum of how many voted for each strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree, and you've seen obviously that median mark where it comes in. Those areas where there was some alignment or some sort of clarity alignment across most people was that obviously what you want to invest in should align with your strategic outcomes and the environmental impact that you want to make. There is a reasonable level of comfort in potentially funding some higher investment projects or over a longer period of time, that the funding should be based on where the need or the identified, sort of environmental outcome that you're trying to achieve. And there is an importance of environmental outcomes on private land. Where there was a broader range of answers, or you might argue a potential, misalignment across individual responses. And again, this might be open to interpretation of the context of how you're interpreting the questions, was the role within the environmental funding, and I'm meaning from the whole pot of the funding, from the one-off type of project to your longer term investment. Like I mentioned before, and you all know, you know, environmental change is not necessarily a 12 months, you'll get some outputs. Long-term environmental change is harder. You know, whether the purpose is seed funding or more longer term support for whole program support. And then what the large multi-year funding would look like and the role that ORC has in that in the longer term, the contribution to salary costs. I know from the discussion Libby and I have had, you know, there's a challenge that a lot of organisations and Class 4 gaming funding or other places that organisations would go to get support for their projects don't fund salary costs anymore. So if you're sort of the last man standing of funding those types of services, is there a, you know, an ethical consideration of projects and programs long term if that funding didn't support that? And a level of didn't get a huge sense that everyone was in agreement around the accountability that they get from the work that's already been done. But again, I appreciate that there was some, maybe not everyone understood the question as it was intended. So that was sort of, I'll leave that there in terms of discussion points.
Does anyone have any comments they want to make now on that, or we're going to have a break? I'm happy to give my comments. I think of the accountability, I think we're actually quite slack at using some of the funding we get as exemplars of what can happen. And even if it's just one day a year, that there's open days where people can come and see that sort of stuff. I've talked about it with Wild and even at times just the ones on the peninsula. You know, there's some brilliant stuff that's happening with not our money, it is the ratepayers' money. And that's something we often forget about. That comes at it's other people's money that they've worked hard to get, and we're choosing to put it into other people's pockets. So I think there is some public scrutiny that should be available for that. I'm concerned about the crossover with DOC. I know that we've funded DOC projects now, and that is because the needs must. But I think we need to have some really clear guidance around that and how that works. You know, us funding recovery work for long-tail bats on DOC land just seems slightly concerning. And I actually wonder about the opportunity, if we were really going to get deep dive into the space, is whether we sign off on a land and water plan tomorrow, there is the offset provisions in there that we may be able to put up projects for offsetting. Not that it's my favourite thing, I think offset's a terrible way of planning, but if there were projects we could be working with offsets to get the highest priority. It just came to me while you were talking about those sort of things, that we could have a number of projects that would be able to work in that space. Anyway, Alan, who's Eco Chair, so knows all this stuff well.
Well, some of it perhaps. I was going to say, look, around the salary cost, I think that can be a very valuable thing the ORC can do. And I know that has been confusing for some applicants, the 50%, but in the Eco Fund, and I would be quite happy to fund more than that. And I guess I see that as really important. We're talking community-led projects. Some of that salary cost can be organising all those volunteers. So I think we can get very, very good value for money for that. And yeah, I don't need to go any further onto the role of people working in the back room and the value that they bring to all sorts of organisations.
So be outcomes driven rather than worrying about the bits and pieces. Yeah. Kevin.
I'm pretty much in agreement with Alan, but it has to be time limited, because otherwise there's the expectation of the dependency on paying someone's salary for the next 20 years. So I think all those projects need to be time limited. I have no problem with salary at all. And probably that's one of the biggest concerns of the $61 million that's already gone into Otago, that so much of it has gone into wages that those people are now expecting employment to carry on. And that's when, and we've seen that. I'm just thinking of the Wallaby one where we've all of a sudden had to scale back things because we haven't got the funding to pay those salaries. And perhaps, it must be time limited. It must be time limited because you've got other projects still coming on. So if you're going to pay that $10 for salaries for the next 20 years, how do I get the next projects going and started? And how do I tell them, well, actually I can't afford it this year because we can't put the rates up. So the time must be time limited.
I'm glad that you're prepared to be paid $10 an hour to do something. Thank you. And
are you going to give me a pay rise?
Just something that wasn't yes, I'm not sure if there is alignment around the table or not, and up to either way, but I was just curious whether there might be alignment around the table as to that topic of in-kind support through not cash, whether that's expertise or knowledge through staff resources, or whether that's, you know, amazing transport stuff, just the stuff that we might have that groups might want, but for a short period of time that could be tools or something like that. Where it might be more efficient for us to loan that or give that to a group rather than them spending the money on buying it themselves or something like that. And just if there might be ways of increasing that in kind or making that more clear as to how we might support groups through other methods. But yeah, I was just curious what the table thought around that kind of support.
Can I just peel that back? One is, do we accept in the funding model, the application coming in with 50% as in-kind contribution from that group? I don't know, because that's also one, some people say it has to be cash up front, not in-kind contributions. So there's two sides to that.
Oh, you're talking about the staff, 50/50.
Anything. So if I'm coming in with an application, I've just filed two this morning. If some of that's in-kind contribution, say labour,
Right.
is that accounted for in the?
Oh, from there,
as well, from
from
there
their
as
side of
well,
things,
because
yeah.
it's both sides that we have to look at, and that's not always, some funding doesn't accept that. And yours is from whether we can contribute
Yeah.
internally or link people up.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I get that, sorry. Alan, did you, Andrew, sorry.
With regards to scholarships, I didn't agree with that, and I think hence didn't make the cut, because obviously the majority felt similarly. However, I agree with the concept, and I think, talking to Richard just for a moment, is that that's something potentially through operations via Richard or via the GMs or whoever. Those opportunities, I'm sure they exist where, you know, that can be tapped into. So I don't know whether
Things like scholarships.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
don't know
I
around
mean,
the table.
for example, we're currently funding a PhD into wetlands as part of our program through science. So it's something we would do as a matter of course, because it benefits our wider work program and it benefits university and students as well.
Because it would be good to know what activities they're focused with. There's more than one or whatever.
Yeah, it's an as opportunities arise type of scenario.
Yep, but that would be good to know for governance to know that that is happening, because it's something that I think we've probably got an interest in.
And the doctoral student? Your question?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that and say, even if there's not scholarships or, you know, explicit scholarships through this funding, there's definitely other ways we can work more closely with
Yeah.
the university and that stuff, whether that's, you know, undergrad students through the ecology program and stuff like that, and projects they're working on that we can
Roy
make the
Somerville,
most of. And
Roy Somerville certainly challenged us and his time as Chancellor to be doing exactly that, which is be great. And I think Alexa had some communication with him, but Libby Person and Alexa.
I was just going to say that we have in the past done summer internships for undergrads or master's students to help do research projects. So that is something that we have been doing to date, but it is something that we could look at strengthening as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Excuse me, Richard. Oh, sorry, I've only got one. I just wondered, it might be a bit of a rogue idea, but have we thought about possibly taking this funding outside of our direct operations and putting it in the hands of some sort of incorporated society or community that's responsible for this?
But
It's yeah, that has been suggested in Queenstown by the conservation people up there, is that maybe there's another way of spending this that would be better. Have we considered that at all, or would we?
Emma,
That is a possibility in terms of the final report, the sort of more worked out options. I think what we put in the final report will obviously have those ideas outlined with that risk analysis of by doing that. Obviously, there is an inherent element of risk by giving ratepayer money to a third party when there's an accountability at this board level for that, but that's not to say that everything's off the table. We've been asked by Libby to give sort of that context and those options from a range of options. The only other point I just want to make around the question around the scholarships and the research is, from some of the work we have been doing at looking at other countries, there is quite an inherent element of either scholarships, research or education support through a lot of other environmental funding, and that was something that came up through talking with Elodie and the team around the education type work often falls to the lower priority on the EcoFund assessment based on the current criteria, and also from the LTP feedback came in that people wanted more support around education and research. So what that might look like might be a number of different things, but I suppose that was the context for that type of question in there as well.
Thank you, Alex.
There are some very, very good examples around New Zealand and around the world of that sort of model working where it's taken out and these things coming back down to grassroots.
And that's great to know, but I will challenge you to tell me that that's a ratepayer funded one as opposed to a philanthropic one.
No, totally ratepayer funded, and the example for that would be Destination Queenstown, where the rate is collected as a targeted rate on the commercial properties, and the money is given over to to some organisation.
RTO,
And it's a very unusual RTO. I think it's the only one in the country that's funded that way.
Thank you.
And it's been highly successful, just as a thought.
Don't Taranaki Regional Council have an environmental trust based on Alexis comment? Did they?
I don't know. That's what I
A
just
number of
asked.
councils do, I think,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you, and that's something that will come back, that sounds great, that's just, I understand philanthropic process, yeah. Now, is it us having a break, because I've got the hand up?
That is, if there's
You,
no more
I,
comments.
there aren't, I mean, it's an hour and a half and you just deserve a break, and Rena and Libby, we've grilled you, thank you.
So we've factored in about a 10-minute break, and then we'll go through the last part of the survey questions and then try and get to some consensus point of where to from here.
Excellent, thank you very, very much. See you in 10, 8:15. 15. Thank you for those that understand what a watch means and does, and the 10 minutes that is now well and truly gone by, and these poor long-suffering consultants who've been sitting at the table for that time. Thank you. Wonderful stuff. We understand the results of our contribution to the survey, and now we're going to go into your thinking. Is that right?
Probably the last section of the results around some of the other questions around how the way that the initiatives are currently funded. So similar sort of structure to what we spent the last bit of time doing, and then we'll go into some further discussion. One of the questions we asked was around the priority and impact of the current funding that you have in terms of the importance of the contestable versus the non-contestable, your incentive and your, should say, large scale biodiversity funding, which is that $300,000 pot, which was introduced last year, to assess the level of priority and the level of impact that you think that funding is having. The first graph shows the average, the mean sort of where that came out. And you can see there that the sort of the highest impact, highest priority was around some of that non-contestable funding. Noting obviously for the context of answering this, there isn't any potentially robust impact information, so it's opinion. The other graph is the range of responses. There's an awful lot of dots there, but essentially you'll see from that the level of agreement around the importance or priority and the impact that those different types of funding is having is quite vast across councillors. with obviously, if you look at the red, which is your incentive, those small pot, or those $50,000 and $100,000 pots that are there at the moment, from quite low priority, low impact, right through to high priority, high impact. So again, it's not necessarily an answer for anything, it is just showing in terms of your current thinking.
And thank you, I got frustrated with this, and it was this question because it didn't have a
It didn't
time.
give you the graph.
And
It didn't have
it's
time
time,
scale.
and so things may have a high impact over time. But yeah, and that's where we all like instant, we're the 5 second community, you know, social media has led us to wanting instant gratification these days, and it's not always quite like that, so it's that diagonal or time lapse that I found frustrating, wasn't really reflected in that, but I don't know how you do that.
So when you answered, what was the time, what time series did you have in mind answering it?
For the greatest environmental input, we know may take 7 to 10 years. And especially when it comes to a biodiversity and saving it, you know, how many years have they been in Kakapo? I mean, yeah, or the yellow-eyed penguin. And so it's those things that are really, they're long lead-ins. And so I found it, that I just want to make the comment, I found it really hard because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Elliot, did you have a question or statements like mine?
Sorry, apologies for lateness there, or if this has been discussed already, but my question when reading through this was what are staff or what does the literature say is the impact of these different types of funding? Because I was putting down, you know, a tick on a scale, but I don't know for sure.
So we were talking about the start that this was just an opinion. So we didn't provide any information to anyone to inform that opinion. And I guess because we have a whole range of different incentive funding that we provide, it's hard to put that into one category. We probably need to do some research into what the literature does say as well around what the impact is of each of the types of things we're delivering. So that, I mean, that could be something that we look at more to ensure that we are investing in the right activity to get the outcome we're looking for, I guess.
Yes, I know that there is and I don't presume it's not something that's going to directly tell us, you know, this is going to get you these specific outcomes, but there's definitely a lot of literature out there on where you can get the best bang for buck in investing in this kind of environmental work, and feels like we should be starting with that rather than, I don't know.
Yeah, so
The low-hanging fruit.
and you're looking at different outcomes potentially for each of the different categories as well. So if we're large scale funding, you're looking at an environmental outcome, whereas if we're general contestable, it might be more of your community and environmental together. So that's harder to measure. It's multiple facets that you're trying to understand, I guess, as well.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Or Emma, go for it.
Thank you. The next couple of slides reflect the next two questions, which was around priority funding across the different groups of existing, and then looking at the new funding as one kind of pot on its own, and then asking you for your opinion that if you had to break down the allocation of where the money went, where would you put that? The good thing here is it was reasonably consistent. So what people thought was the highest priority, they would give the most money to. Apart from the non-contestable and the general contestable, but you're only looking at little bits, which for the number of people who did the survey might be one person, so it's not really hugely important. But really from this, what people noted was that the highest priority was around the large scale environmental. And look, again, contextual is important here and wasn't necessarily provided. There was no question of, you know, if X, Y, and Z happened, what would be your highest priority? So I'm assuming from some of the results that people had, and please tell me otherwise, that in terms of that was answered from the contextual viewpoint, that was going to have an impact. It was a large pot of money. If you invested it well, it was going to have an environmental impact and therefore was priority. Or maybe people answered knowing that there was already funds and activities already existing that you weren't thinking was necessarily in scope or as part of a whole wider funding. But interestingly, from the last graph around people's opinion of the priority and impact incentive funding did come out lower, and it has come out lower again in both the percentage of funds people would allocate and also the priority of people funding. So when one of those funds didn't have any applications to it last year, you know, is that a question? And I know that's more probably in Elodie and Anna's space in terms of some of the short-term ways that the Eco Fund is managed or that wider funding.
Or the fact that because we've got it incentivized, you then can't reallocate it, which is when you see 400% over allocation, you think, that's a real, So having that nuance so that you can reallocate.
Yes, and I suppose that comes back to that wider discussion around how the whole money is used in the long term and strategically how you allocate it.
Yeah, and the incentive funding at the moment is aligned to specific outcomes we're looking to achieve. So if there's incentive funding for sustainable river management, for example, that sits in our biosecurity budget. So we can't then just allocate that to water quality because it's ratepayers have paid for us to achieve biosecurity outcomes. So that's how it's set up now. Whether it should be set up that way in the future is another question.
Well, the problem is if you don't get any applications, you're rated something that you have to sit on a pot of money and not necessarily any certainty that it will be used for any environmental good in any time soon. So that's it. Appreciate the focus and it's limited to that pot, but then it's not doing any good in our bank account either.
That's right, but we could allocate it to some other biosecurity outcome, I guess, if in the longer term. It's hard to do that when we've already had our applications closed, but that's why each year we look at what are the things that people are interested in doing and what's the focus for our teams to achieve outcomes for, and we try and set up our incentive funding to align so that we're not going to underspend. In some cases we do, but we do try our best to ensure that it's a fit for purpose fund and it's not just something no one's interested in.
Thank you. Clarity.
And sort of for interest, I took the answers from this and overlaid it with what the current funding allocation is. So this is based on the proposed, say, rank that people gave in order of priority. And I've put beside it the current percentage of your overall money that goes to it and the current money. And if based on the ranking, you were to allocate money that way going forward, what it might look like. Probably the most notable discrepancy there is the direct funding, because at the moment 56% of that whole pot is going to direct funding. Based on what people said in the survey, that would drop to 15%, which would, assuming a current pot of just over 2 million, 1.1 million is going in that. In the future, if you looked at the 4 million as a whole, you would drop that to $600,000, which would have significant impacts on some of those big projects which are being funded through that at the moment.
Sorry, go for it.
Thanks, because I remember putting this in as well, because this is one thing here, because the large scale environmental new funding, it may be via direct or contestable.
Yes, the method
So
isn't
it's a
being,
double. So which one do you pick first? Like you see what I'm saying? But
Yes,
just
and-
because it says large scale environmental funding is way up the top there, it's probably a large percentage that would be direct funding as well.
And I suppose that's something that
Put in
hasn't,
via direct funding.
that hasn't been determined as,
But that's direct funding that's actually already happening, isn't it?
yes.
Yeah, the 1.151 is already happening. That's what we're already direct funding.
How much of that existing funding is carrying on? Because I know that Predatory Free wasn't necessarily carrying on. I just need to, I'm sorry.
Yeah, majority of it is carrying on.
Yeah.
We need to assess whether we continue with predator free Dunedin. We're just waiting on some reports to justify that. But
There was the X amount of dollars that may or may not go to them.
it's the same.
still-
It's the same.
I couldn't remember how we did that. Thank you.
The 5-year funding for predator fee.
Oh yes, sorry. This is for the
But
Osprey
there was an
transition.
ongoing project that was specific to an Osprey transition that predator free were delivering.
Yeah, and we've got an agreement with them that we will continue to support the Osprey project, but it's not the wider predator free initial project that ended after 5 years. But there is it's still predator free.
No, that's fine. I just wasn't quite sure how long we'd extended and kept it in because we knew we were doing this. So thanks. Okay, Emma.
So again, not really giving any answers, but it's just showing that if the context, yeah, the ranking, that's what it would look like from a money point of view going forward. So the questions that I had was, was there anything that surprised you from what came out from that? Is there any preferences? Does that a representation of what you really think collectively? Is there an element of needing to know whether the new funding is direct or contestable? Or anything else I suppose you want to add, or questions that remain unanswered, or anything you want to change? I know a couple of the comments I got on email and writing was around not necessarily allocating by a type, but looking at the overall outcome again. So
Any comments? Helen?
Yeah, it was a one of your difficult questions that you gave us. And I think that's partly because when I was looking at this new fund, thinking, oh, that could actually take over quite a few bits of those other funds, those existing funds. And so I ended up with a much larger allocation to the new fund, partly because I thought it was going to take over some of those other bits. So I think that's my explanation of why we might have got some different answers there.
So, but this, the balance, Alan, the balance we now see, does that sort of look right? Like the final future figures? Is that sort of,
Which one are you looking at,
my
Kevin?
conception of it, no.
no, well, that's, that's that page back
That one
slide,
there. Okay.
yeah.
Thanks. Elliot, did you? Sorry, go.
I guess, that is similar, and I think the direct funding stuff, all of those current partnerships and stuff that are going really well, I wouldn't want to see any funding to them be decreased in any way because of this. But again, I'm just turning to, I just want to know where staff and the literature says that the allocation should be and where the money would be best divvied up between those.
We can bring some of that back, I guess, but we're looking for some guidance around what would be the preferred way of providing this funding to our communities from this table. So that, I guess that might not help, but that's what we're looking for from all of you is do we prefer to have everything contestable or everything direct or a mixture of both? And I think what you're saying at the moment is a mixture of both is good, but how much do we lean towards one way or the other? And this table shows the direct funding would be a lower priority. Or evenly, maybe, I don't know.
I guess I'm just, because the question, like, it is a question for us, but and I know it's not a helpful answer, but I guess my answer is wherever it's going to have the best biodiversity outcomes. But if we don't, and I just feel like there might be some way of giving some more context to that, so that we can at least predict where might best have the most biodiversity outcomes. But I think ultimately it should definitely be a mix. But I wouldn't want to see the direct as low as that unless.
But that's a good, if that is a direction, that is a good direction.
It
And
is,
it's
okay.
around seeing the biodiversity outcomes, and we can bring back options that look at that. Because at the moment that hasn't been clear that we're looking to achieve biodiversity outcomes all of the time.
But that would be my answer.
Yeah, so I don't know if that's everyone's answer, but that would help us to develop up something that you can then consider options on.
Kevin?
I'm probably very similar, but I'm just not, I'm saying environmental outcomes as opposed to limiting them just to bio. So that would be my only change there. But look, I'm probably, we the direct funding I think I've clicked to what Alan was saying. I was probably thinking some of that big direct funding probably would have slipped up into the large scale ongoing. Well, that's what I had in my head, so that's why I put the large scale up further. But I'm not too worried about dropping direct funding if the direct funding is not actually achieving the outcomes. So I'm really looking for some information saying for dollars spent, income, outcomes, and we're achieving it, and we've got this project's going for another 3 years. Bang, that's all good. Let's carry on with it. I'd rather see the quality of the outcomes for the money spent. And it doesn't have to be just biodiversity. That's what I'm sort of saying, all those categories. Yeah. And look, I am probably keener, again, based on outcomes and the best environmental gains we can get. I would be keener on more direct funding for set periods, saying that, well, here's the documentation, here's the proof of outcomes that will be provided, or the schemes do provide those sort of outcomes, and we're backing those. Yes, we're backing the winners because we're getting the best environmental outcomes for the community and for the environment. So, and it wouldn't worry me if the large of all those fundings were more direct, because that gives certainty to the people getting it. But they'd all have to be time limited, because I don't want dependency on salaries. That's what I'm sort of thinking.
Can I ask the question on that?
Yeah.
To do the direct funding, would you have kind of like a period of put your application forward so that you know what to direct fund? Because if you end up with a first in, first serve kind of process on how you fund directly, that's a different.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Yeah, so we need to evaluate what's there and what's coming in, and what we don't want to have is a process that doesn't give us the opportunity to look at what it's about and what the very best options are. So you'd have to. That sounds nutty, doesn't it? I want it. It's contestable, but it's not really contestable.
So maybe it's contestable but long term. So that you're direct funding it longer term after a contestable process.
Yeah, that's probably because we've got to evaluate it, haven't we?
Yeah, that's for you to decide, but.
Yeah, I'd suggest probably coming up to October next year. Most people would like to know that we've evaluated the 2 million.
Yeah, I've got Alan and Lloyd and Gretchen.
If we're talking around funding methods, yep. I guess I would think it would be a good idea to make the large majority of this funding through a direct funding mechanism. And I think there's two reasons for that. I agree with much of what Kevin said. One is that allows us as the ORC to identify where our priorities are. Yeah. And I think that's really important. We know this area. We can say, well, here are the things that really matter an awful lot. Another is that competitive contestable funding processes can be so unhelpful for those organisations having to compete for them. And they can take up such a lot of resources and can make them sort of try and bend to the funding rules, which is really, really so unhelpful. I think a contestable fund, something along the likes of the Eco Fund, would be very good to remain for, in particular, those aims around community empowerment of smaller groups. The other thing I think that really is important, and we've touched on this, is the continuity of funding. And so we don't run into the situation where it goes for a while and suddenly it's gone, and then risk of not being able to maintain the work that's being done. And for that reason, I'm less tied to the idea of putting short-term time limits on things. I think actually it may be quite valuable to give organisations the certainty that there's some funding coming for quite a long period of time. And I don't expect that will be funding the total operations of the organisation, but it could be funding some important parts of it. And in terms of the direct funding, this mechanism that could be for this new fund saying, here's an area, you look after the Upper Lakes, you look after the Dunedin area, but also those organisations such as who are doing specific jobs like conifer control, or it could be wallaby control over an area, but with that one specific aim in mind. So that direct funding could apply to that as well as the current direct funding does.
Can I just ask a question on that, Councillor Somerville, around, there's a lot of different priorities in the environmental space. So how, in that direct funding model, would you identify what those priorities are? Because $2 million isn't going to get you very far.
No, that's right. And I guess, I mean, we've heard from who? Southern Lake Sanctuary and others saying it would be to have some level of funding from the ORC would then let them leverage further. So I suppose I'm thinking, is it possible to identify organisations such as that, but in other areas of Otago, to say, here's some money, you're looking after this area now, and here are the areas we would, you know, the parts of that, you know, some things around biodiversity and biosecurity and water quality and air quality and whatever. We wouldn't expect it to go all the way because we just haven't got enough money for that. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that to identify the priorities, you'd identify the organisation that's going to get the most success.
Well, I think not quite that, but to say to this organisation, here are the things we'd like you to do.
Yeah.
And with our knowledge of those priorities and our knowledge of established organisations.
Thank you.
Lloyd?
You know, pretty much exactly the same. I think you got to have some contestable funding, but I think the direct funding route is going to become the main route. But you still have to. I see the direct funding route as you've got existing established organisations that have been doing it. They need surety of money, surety of funds going forward. So, you know, we've already got quite a number of groups there now. So for me, they need to be on a group. They need to be directly funded to whatever amount, so they know where they're at. But then there'll be a whole lot of other groups out there or new ones starting up. So that's going to be, for that to work, that has to be contestable. And it might be a contestable direct fund or a contestable, you know, short-term funds, but it has to be a contestable at some level until the group gets the runs on the board. So you actually know, I don't think we should be going out there studying people's, I don't think we should be going out there picking winners without them coming to us first, if that makes sense. So that creates a contestable playing field. So I think it's a mix of both. And probably my tendency is for the larger scale stuff is that we're going to be working with known organisations, so there'll be more direct, you know, for a period of time. You've still got your time limits and stuff, but yeah, so they get some sureties. And I'm not too sure whether incentive funding fits into all this still, but so that's probably because, you know, the incentive funding is the same, but we're talking about a large, you know, the environmental stuff, but the incentive funding, some of that may be direct, but I assume that would be probably more contestable on smaller scale. That makes sense?
Gretchen and then Alexa.
I think
Sorry.
that mine was actually covered before, so thanks, Kate.
Okay.
It was.
I know I'm sorry, I should have taken straight away.
Multitasking, yeah, no, it
Sorry,
was.
yeah, I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Alexa.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about the relationship between some of these fundings, whether they be contestable or whatever they are, or incentives, and how we're going to have that relationship with the large scale funding. Because some of these ones that are going into direct funding and contestable funding may well be part of large scale funding too. So how are you thinking about that, or have we?
That's us giving them advice. That's why they were here doing today. Sorry, I appreciate your way. You give your advice of how you see it working. Should it be direct or?
I don't know. I'm thinking about it, but I was just wondering how you're thinking about that relationship between those things.
I don't have a specific opinion on that. I think we would need to be clear in our criteria around what the outcomes we're looking for from incentive funding are in large scale.
Mm.
And from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the incentive and eco fund general kind of going forward would look at seed funding, whereas large scale would be looking to support groups that already exist and are established. So the
Other way,
the other way,
sorry. Jump in.
you go.
Large scale seed funding to enable greater work with other investors.
Yeah.
Leverage others.
Leverage.
Small scale eco fund is around the doing that the smaller groups are out there. So
That's not what Lloyd. I heard from Lloyd we would
Well, I was giving, still
fund the
stopping you.
community groups
I'm
to seed
sorry,
funding.
Yeah.
Anyway, doesn't matter.
Yeah, no,
Okay,
they're all valid things. I think it's less the mechanism.
This part of the thing really confuses the bejesus out of me, to be honest, because you've got large scale environmental and biodiversity stuff, which is outputs, and then you've got incentive funding and output, and the two in the middle is
It's method.
is a method pot.
Yeah.
Because you can't have them all on the same table, so
Yeah,
so
I think we're all outcomes driven.
I think we're all actually trying to get the same answer.
Yeah.
be simple.
Okay. The one thing that didn't come through here, and I thought I'd put it in, was ICM. Integrated catchment management, which is that large scale. And that's where I said the priorities don't fit, because they will change in the Catlins and they will from the Upper Lakes Row here, as they will from Maniheta here. And I don't know if Gary's still here, sorry Gary, but yeah, he is here. Please pipe in if you do. I can't see you if you have a question. Oh, he has got, I can't see it. So, okay, that's great. I'll come back to you very shortly. Anyway, so I think for me, unless we haven't got an ICM funding source yet, which I think would be really important to be able to do through here as well. And I'm just putting it out there because I think that will give you a whole lot of groups being forced to or encouraged to work together, maybe for the first time, but that doesn't exclude them from necessarily doing large scale. And using that CAP process, which I think is quite exciting. Anyway.
And that's that bringing it together.
Yeah.
Under there that you were actually talking about just as I walked in.
Yeah.
How you bring those under.
So, so can I go to Gary since I think he's been waiting for some time, and then you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry for lateness. My position is possibly the polar opposite to everyone else. I think it should only be contestable funding, purely because I'm not a fan of us becoming long-term funders for operations that will then rely on us into the future and create a situation of their sustainability relies on us. I think we should be the potentially what I suppose I'll describe as startup funding and have this funding totally contestable. It may be that over a 3-year time period we would fund, but beyond that they would need their own sustainability beyond that. So I'm for all of it would be the contestable funding place. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Kevin.
Yeah, probably flicking things around just a wee bit is that have we identified the problem that we're trying to fix? So if you go back to the Halo project, which is, I think, about getting rid of pests or possums or whatever it was in this area. So they designed that and then they got a group.
Bring the carpet back to the option was the other way.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So if we went into specific areas and we've got all these categories, but surely we should be looking at an area that has got an issue and then finding the best way to sort that issue by having organisations or groups contest funding to fix that issue. And so we've got a rampant wallaby population on the Waitaki Plains, which we haven't, by the way, because the team's done a very good job. So we need someone to fix that up there. Come to us, tell us your way of doing it, your history, the outcomes that you can achieve, and this is the amount of money we'd have available for it, or you need this amount of money, we can give you so much of it. So I just think we're all actually saying the same things, but we're probably we need to be identifying the problem before we actually say,
are we fixing a problem of ours, or are we fixing something we want to fix? which is.
Yeah, and because a lot of the problems that we might have might actually just be, all we need is one person standing in the corner, the corner of the main street or Wacker, with a sandwich board on saying, please shoot the pests when you see them. And that might do the job. I know that's a bit blasé, but you know what I mean? So we actually haven't identified the problem that we're trying to fix before we actually work out the best ways of fixing something. So
Kevin, you're offering to put out for us to Doodle poll a definition of large scale.
would have to be on
environmental.
paper.
Or do you want the consultants to do that?
But you know what I'm saying? Like I think we all want environmental gains, get the best bang for buck, and really make sure this is happening and ongoing. But
Is
if
it
we
the
haven't,
best bang for bucks or the best thing we can invest in?
well, that is the best bang for buck, because you get the best thing you can invest in, because it will be giving us a sustainable environmental gain. I don't quantify it just to money.
No.
If you know what, yeah. But I think we've got to actually, it'd be really neat to actually identify one major problem in one area and say, well, and workshop how we'd fix that.
That's where I think the cats will come along with something.
Yeah.
And it's tied up in the non-regulatory space, which is really good. The disadvantage is that we're doing this while we're still developing the cats.
Yeah, but we won't have a full set of those for a number of years. And
No.
Next year, we've got $2 million that we're raising in the community for, and we need to have a way of doing something with that that is shown to be value for money. So I know this is not an easy decision. You can rest assured that staff will bring you something that will enable you to make some decisions based on what we feel would be the best value for money.
Yes.
That's ultimately what we will use our expertise to work on. What we're trying to just get is framing up big principle level, how you want to give this out. And then there will be a whole lot of work that sits in underneath that will use our staff expertise and knowledge. And over time, CAPS will absolutely come into that, but that's a long way off where we will have equity of catchment action plans right across our region to drive investment through these sort of funds. We need something in the interim that allows us to use this wisely. And that may mean some years it doesn't all get used and it carries over and the fund gets bigger future. You know, there's different scenarios that play out, but we just need to understand at a high level, you know, what's the sort of table's desire in terms of this new fund sitting alongside, you know, what we've seen today, which is that we already have a lot of money going out the door. I know it's not a lot in terms of the wider environmental issues, but for a council in terms of our overall budget, it's not a significant sum of money. So that's where we're at. You know, it's not going to be perfect first year. I can almost assure everybody of that. But we need something that enables us to get started and then will allow it to develop and mature over time as we do start to get more catchment action plans, which will capture community visions and priorities and bang for buck and those sorts of things. So there's a few things to think about in there. I guess I'd just caution again about diving too far into the details and how to get it perfect, and just think about as a table, if you were speaking to your community about what are we doing with that $2 million we're raising you for each year, that you'll have a level of comfort explaining how we've decided how to use that.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question before I go to Andrew's next? Is the CE, I think, has indicated almost then, but I just want to check that you'd almost prefer that we keep what we've got as existing and this new one, so that we've got some continuity and the new one be separate, or
I think that there is a role for the existing. I'm not saying the values have to stay exactly as they are. There is a role for the smaller scale. I don't know, ad hoc makes it sound, I don't mean that in a negative way, but that sort of funding plays a really important role in our community, encouraging those groups to stand up and get out there and take action. So I think there is always a role for that. What we don't have a clear understanding of is at the moment, and it was never envisaged we had a clear understanding when the decision was made through the LTP, is how we would use this new funding that is coming on stream from 1 July. It doesn't mean to say that we can't make some amendments to those existing numbers that were back on much earlier slides, but I think that keeping a level of separation is probably a smart thing to do.
I just think it's a really good context, and I think from what we're saying, I think we're just, I just want to make sure we're sort of in agreement. So I've got Andrew and then I've got you, Kevin.
Just thinking back to why we're having this conversation, and Alexa will remember when the Southern Sanctuary Trust first started talking to us about their project that they had a vision for 30,000 hectares or whatever it was. And I remember meeting, Alexa and I met with Leslie, whose surname I've forgotten. However, it was such a massive project. It was just obviously too big for us to even get our heads around, let alone fund. And I think they might have got some operational funding through probably what was previously the department that now Libby looks after, whatever. And I mean, that was just a drop in the bucket to what they needed. So I think that's the problem I think we're trying to solve. In terms of contestable, direct or whatever, obviously we've probably got to have a combination, horses for courses or whatever, different options there. I just want to go back to Gary's point. I think I'm on the same page, just going back to empowering the community, empowering people, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's so important for us to do that rather than we think we've got all the, I don't say we do this, but we think we've got all the solutions. I think the more that we can just give people or community groups just that leg up so that then they can go out and deliver. And so creating an environment for those sorts of organisations and individuals that can be successful, can be enduring, and to get a good environmental outcome. I think that's why we're here.
Right. Kevin, you were going to be next.
Yeah,
What do you-
so wrapping all that up into a solution for this $2 million to show that that's what we're trying to do. And my gut feeling is that we need to, and I do believe that it needs to be contestable who we give the money to, and but what are they going to give it to for? And once they've got it, it needs to be for a set period so they can actually go and do it. But I don't want them jumping in every year. So my gut thinking is that we invite organisations or groups to submit projects that give Otago environmental gains, and that we tag it with a number, and whether that be up to $1 million a year for the maximum of a 5-year period. So someone like Southern Lakes could jump in and say, well, listen, if we do this right, we're going to get $1 million a year for the next 5 years. What does that look like? And providing if we then we do a bigger scale eco fund, in that we're looking at environmental gain projects, sit down, analyse them, bang, you've got it for the next 3 to 5 years. Very much like the Halo project ended up getting anyway. So
Yeah, but they came up with a need and then came up with a budget. And what I don't like about yours is you set a target up high for them to apply for.
Yeah, I do, but you're not coming up with a need from. I mean, I can give you the need. I mean, we could do that at the start and say, well, we've got a loss of something in an area. Well, here's what we want fixed, but we haven't come up with that yet.
You could do expressions of interest and then develop them further, because I think the net application.
Yeah.
Should be
Just noted
big.
it down between each other. Yeah.
That's right.
An expression of interest process, and then see what ticks most boxes. Really,
Yeah.
Excellent.
I think this is about large scale
Yes, it is.
regeneration, and that's and this is about providing some funding to give the groups that apply for it this piece of credibility that they can go out and leverage that money and find other ways of bringing that budget up to something that's reasonable, that they can actually do something with. So it's not, we don't have to look for the problems. They're already there, and they're described, and they are well articulated in their strategic documents and actually in our own ones. And so I think that we've got to be quite clear on that these people are trying to do the same sorts of things that we're trying to do, and they're better placed to do so. We can't afford to have them fully funded, but so we give them something enough for them to get going so that they can go and find that money. That's what's important. This is where the collaboration really comes in.
I emphasize something you just said. I think the other thing that's really important for me is that I don't think we're going to have a discussion in November about the regional pest management plan. When we say we want to tick boxes that are aligned to ours, I'm slightly nervous that I think pigs, possums, deer, they may not be species, but I think getting rid of them is aligned to what we want done, but the level of risk or heightened in our plan may not be there, whereas some things are high up there already. In some areas, they are devastating what they're doing. You can't plant plants until you get rid of them. So again, it's that nuance that while they may be ticking boxes of where we want to go, some won't be able to tick the boxes necessarily because our plans may not be as
Well,
robust.
yeah, but they'll still show us, like if the project is,
Yeah, no,
I
no,
don't think we'll be that blind that we can't see a project that is of environmental gain that just because one of our plans needs reviewed or something, we're not gonna not recognise, surely, our team.
It's
staff
really
in it.
hard when you're doing stuff, and I just want to.
Yeah.
And the other point I want to make is that saving something you've already got is sometimes better than trying to create something new. So if I compare Middlemarch, which is bereft of a lot of biodiversity values, with exceptions, because the mountain is fantastic and it's got heaps there if you go looking for it, to something that has been absolutely eaten out by deer and pigs in the Catlins, I'd say an investment in the Catlins would give a big bang at the moment because you've got amazing values here. You've got 500-year-old ring trees that are suffering.
Getting beaten up,
So those sort of things that have to be balanced in there, and so if we don't spread this money around, we're going to be hit over the head by ratepayers. We just have to be really careful about that as well. I don't know that answers your question, so I'm just saying.
No, but it's really interesting discussion and sort of, I suppose, like we said, the questions weren't to solve or an answer about an operational detail, but it sparked really good discussion around where people's views lie, and it gives you a chance to debate. There's just two last questions that we'll quickly go through. Hopefully the next one won't spark the level of conversation, but this might be where some of your comments were from, Councillor Wilson, in terms of some of those other potential investment areas. And there's possibly, other funding or other funding stream that already exist, which may be within ORC or outside of ORC that might support. I wasn't going to cover this one in too much detail unless there was anything burning.
Can I just check about the clean home heating, the indoor fire replacement and the home insulation? I presume they're all under, can anyone tell me if I've got this wrong, is under a rate mechanism rather than a fund? Or if I got that wrong? That's where I would see them. Is that?
It's out of scope of this.
It's out of scope.
Okay,
That was just asking the question about if people want to see other things covered. That was sort of the comments that came.
The air plan review and strategy.
That's already in the thought patterns, I'm sure it is.
And we did identify that clean air was one of the things we could be looking at in this. So it seems to me those could conceivably be within scope.
Yeah. The next question that came through was similar to the last one in terms of asking for priority groups and how the funds would be allocated. I think, a reasonable amount of the discussion of where this may or may not fit we've had in the last 10 minutes or so, but was looking at those formal groups or, incorporated societies, charitable trusts, compared to collective groups of landowners, which exist as, able to apply under some of the funds at the moment. We haven't talked yet with Mana Whenua or iwi in terms of where they see their role fitting into some of this, and Libby and I have started the conversation with Okaha, and really also looking at those educational, your schools, play centres, groups that, there's been applications through the Eco Fund, particularly for, establishment of nurseries and gardens and things like that as well. The private landowners, this is where that sort of came in, and then another which
we did actually specify, and the next question was around some of that potential university or CRI type of investment for either scholarships or research. So that's how it was reasonably consistent again, in terms of how people allocated it. I haven't done a table because I didn't have all the data of what organisations get all the money now, and probably didn't feel a huge strategic purpose to do that. But it's whether you want to have any further discussion, I guess, in terms of the types of groups that you want or would prioritise to receive funding. Certainly the conversation from the last point has been around some of those established groups and organisations that are already delivering or intend to deliver some large scale or large impact type initiatives. And we have already talked about the place of some of those smaller type groups and those contestable for those one-off or small year types of projects. So it was really whether you wanted further discussion around that specifically. In some of the notes that I just put was, is the distribution by groups relevant, or is it the outcomes that are more important? Does it matter what the type of organisation is that you would fund to deliver it? Is there a place for tertiary or CRIs or any other types of educational institutions or research based? And how do you want, what does that look like going forward in terms of the types of organisations you want to partner with, particularly if you're looking at large investment?
Alexa's got her hand on the button.
Oh, this is that thinking again about whether, where it sits, the governance of this distribution. If it sits inside us, or if we think of setting up something else to do that. I think the universities sit there as well. I think it's really important. I like your average there. That sounds like a good idea. I have nothing to really base that on, but I take it you've taken that from elsewhere in the world. It's probably worthwhile. Official organisation, yeah, maybe not. I think it depends on what the matrix for the funding is, what's expected from that, and whether the governance of that sits inside or outside of the council. And I think we need to think about that.
Because no one else has their hand on that button, I'm just going to say that I would like to think that if a CRI or tertiary institution had an interest, they would be working with the community groups already in that space to answer the problem, and that would strengthen both an application from a community group. And I think that's where I'd like to see that sort of sitting. We should be encouraging robust reflection and reporting and monitoring, and that comes through in both processes, but push these groups together. The university to be with the community group is a healthy space to be at. Having been involved with the Taieri Trust years ago, where the university was absolutely embedded in community groups, in that space was exciting. Anyone else got any other comments? Anything else you need from us?
Just on Alexa's point, I haven't said anything, but we have had a think about the benefits of setting up what effectively would be an external fund that would obviously still have significant oversight by government, fair enough for that. By governance, that would enable a little bit more flexibility in terms of attracting additional funding. There are mechanisms and ways of setting things up that might be able to broaden the horizons of a fund like this if we thought about it carefully. So those sorts of things I will be expecting staff to give some thought to as we progress this and look at options for setting this up. And I'm only talking about the large scale, not our smaller scale internal stuff we already have systems for. So that has been given some thought, and there are examples around the place where it's used, and it does open up some other avenues when we start talking about additional sources of revenue that we don't necessarily have to attract through rates all the time. So there is some work for us to do there, and again, we're not reinventing the wheel. It would make it more complicated, just in terms of setting it up and time and other things, but I think it's worth thinking about. So you can expect to see something come back through there at some point.
thanks for articulating that. I'd forgotten about the ability of an outside organisation to, they have a far easier, more ability to attract external funding, which this fund needs to do. This fund can't do the
Yeah,
job.
the OIO is one point that has got substantial money and it's going, we're going to get a lot more, I think, coming with forestry. And we're not necessarily getting that spread well into the environment.
There's also organisations like, you know, TRN, TNC, is it, the Nature Conservancy, that they, you know, they do huge scale funding, but you could only, you can't do that from a council. You have to do that from something else, from another entity. There's things we could attract.
Yeah, so can I just,
Worth thinking
the other factor here, and as I said, like today, I've literally filed two applications of funding for a different project, not environmental. But it's that time that they become available. So if you're looking at employment, and these will be, it's making sure they're before the lead-in period for the reporting, their annual budgeting, in a decent way, and not that everyone is on the 30th of June, but quite a few are. So if you can get that funding applications in by March and making your decisions in May, that makes a heck of a lot better run for your budget to get projects working for the next following year. And it's a question, that is actually a question of what does look better. If you're doing it twice a year, it waters down that money funding. I think once a year is great, but again, getting that right and then getting accountability in our papers making sense as well is important.
Cool. This is the last question, which we purposefully left to the end after you'd answered all the others, was to then test what you interpreted large scale to mean, because it's in the papers, it's in the LTP, we talked about it, but what's the clear definition in your own minds of what large scale means to you? And as you can see, there is a reasonable distribution in your answers. To be fair, you could pick up to 3 answers. So, and again, this is not to seal the deal on this is the way forward, but this is to test that conversation of some of the options were loosely or based on the current criteria that you have across your other types of funds, and some of them were just things that we put out there to assess, I suppose, whether your definition of large scale was a time, an impact, or a money type definition, or a mixture of all 3, because the obvious element of this too is if you take 2 million and you invest in 4 projects, but you invest it for 5 years, you only do a funding round every 5 years, you're not allocating money, it's all gone for a long period of time if you're doing multi-year projects. So there's that impact as well, that somebody's not performing or something's not going well, not having impact. There's a process of how you would stop funding that and look to reinvest. So it's looking at, so the 2 kind of top ones there was multi-year up to a maximum value of 100 to 250,000, or multi-year up to a maximum of 500,000. So they were sort of
500,000 per annum.
Per
That's
annum.
important.
Well, it could be per annum or it could be per project.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not set in stone. Obviously, that was just to test what people's thoughts were on that, and just some questions that I noted from that yes, you could pick 3, you know, majority of responses between that 100,000 to 500,000, whether that was per year or per project. And, you know, what do you feel is your definition of large scale, if you were putting that out to the community and having some more set criteria around that? And I mean, we might not, with 15 minutes left, get to that final resolution on that, but it can be money, it can be impact, and it can be time, or it can be all of them.
Any comments? The money man.
Oh, well, a large scale project.
Microphone, please. Gary's listening.
Yes, technology, you see. Large scale project, I don't think any of those really sum up them up, because I'd just say, what southern one?
Lake Sanctuary.
Lake Sanctuary is millions and millions and millions and millions. It's what we are prepared to give to any one project. And that's not necessarily, to me, is not over the total value of the project, but is with the outcomes that they are trying to achieve and what our money can do for them. So I'm sort of go back to what I said earlier. I'd be limiting it to $1 million, so maximum of $1 million, and that might be too high. It might be $500,000. but I wouldn't be going any less than that because I want the big punters to come to us to get the maximum. And if we gave to one group $1 million a year for the next 5 years, that's half our 2 million gone. But I would say within 5 years, because of the impact of that million, if we do it right, the impact of that $1 million to that one group will have huge environmental tracking really, really good. And then that's when we start setting everything else up. So, yeah, I'm
Lex was thinking it's a good idea.
Okay. No,
I'm
Richard,
sorry, I could go, but it's, for me, it's landscape scale rather than
Yep.
value. It's a size thing rather than yeah.
Just what I was going to say too. To me, a large scale is when the Southern Lake Sanctuary is
Thanks for a
working with.
big day, everyone. I'm sorry for going.
That's what I said
tomorrow will be shorter.
As predator free, with predator free Dunedin.
Yep.
And so the landscape scale is the entire of Otago. So it is not about the money because there's nothing that we can spend that we have available to us to do the job that is required to be doing, to solve the problem that needs solving.
Exactly.
That is going to come from those groups working together effectively enough to drag out some real large scale funding from elsewhere. And yeah, that's why I think that we probably do need to think about externalizing some of the governance at any rate, because we need to be looking for, I don't know who else there is, but I know that the Nature Conservancy, I mean, all of Otago would just be a drop in the bucket in terms of their large scale. So those groups have got to start thinking together at that scale.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. But the thing is, we've got to work out what we're going to do with this $2 million for the next 2 to 3 years before we get that sorted.
Well, no, not necessarily. We need to sort this and then apply that money to it. And we'll sort this by talking to those groups and figuring out how they best think that they can start looking for the extra money that they need.
It may be that there's an in-between of a transitional.
Yeah.
Especially with the ICM stuff.
You have to get that.
It'd be good to get that time frame.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Andrew, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I like the landscape scale concept. I like the 500K plus concept. And I think the definition is really, really important. So, you know, we weed out the the ones that we don't want. If the definition is clear, you know, the landscape ones will come to us, sort of thing. So I think it's really important to have a really clear definition of what this fund is about.
Okay. You've made me realise that when Predator Free first came to the regional council, for funding, what made it so good is that they could, depending on which council, because not all councils were doing the same annual plan process, the upfront money, then tapering off allowed other councils to come in the reverse by having a small amount of money and then building up to have and money coming through at different stages and different quantums. That makes sense. So say it was 500,000. I think ORC came through very high at the start, and the DCC then came in heavier later on to balance what the Predator Free Dunedin, New Zealand were given, and that was actually really, really important in that process. So you encouraged that other funding to be able to come in over time. It just reminds me of that.
And you make a really good point, because what that meant was that Predator Free were able to scale up to a size that they ended up contracting work, the DCC, that was predator control, where would have been contracted to whoever else. So they became an entity in their own right, and the scale that they were able to actually secure further work.
Yep.
That meant they became more sustainable.
We've seen this happen too, Kate, since the Jobs for Nature funding. We've seen that funding is finished, and yet the organisations that benefited from did work for all of us all based on that funding, they've had to downscale sometimes quite severely, but they're still in existence.
Yep.
They have found, many of them have found other ways to produce funding and to get themselves commercially viable, to the extent that it starts making me think, as someone that's reasonably interested in economics, going, is there a basis for an economy here? You know, how can we help this become a basis of economy. And I think some of our thinking could be going that way.
And often it is the capital cost to start up, which is the hardest part, and then they get good people coming and volunteering. And it still have to be organised, still have to have some people doing it, but it's how you engage that. Is that everything you need? Have we given any clarity? Now, Jo has now left us, but she had suggested that. Great.
Yeah, I can cover it. So I think it's been really useful. There's still a few questions we've got. And Richard can jump in if he needs to, but I think we still need to get a definition of what large scale is, which would be useful for us to inform our report. We do want to come back and do another workshop. I think we need to do that in the new year.
Yeah.
Before we bring a detailed report around what the options might be. But yeah, there's a few things we need to figure out around definitions and provide some direction to inform the next.
So I think no, I think you're right, Libby. There'll be a workshop in the year. Just remembering too, this is not an annual plan conversation. This is done. This is now just in the normal council reporting cycle to be decided before 1 July. So we're not under any time constraints in terms of annual plan. There does need to be just some thinking around how we're going to define it, linking it back to the long-term plan and what was consulted on and subsequently the decisions that were made. But I think the next workshop will bring back, I guess, some more worked up proposals to pick apart and to critique and have some conversations about, rather than another sort of open discussion. I think there's been enough today. I've certainly taken enough, even though I've been a little bit distracted, listened to most of it. That gives us enough to work from to bring a few things back and just test them in terms of level of comfort, and then from there, the ability to take that through to what would effectively be a paper to set up a policy for the for administering the new fund.
Yeah, I might be asking something that's stupid here. It's funny that we got so much support of something we hadn't defined necessarily particularly well. And so I do think it'll be helpful if we do go back and look at the consultation paper for the long-term plan, because we do need to make sure that we are meeting what people thought we were meeting. But the other one is, I think there are a lot of groups expecting this money to be available on 1st of July next year. And I'm not quite sure how we're thinking about that space and the rollout. Are you thinking that the money will be available?
Well, it is technically it's available, but we won't be ready to administer it on the 1st of July. So we'll just be managing expectations. There was never any chance that this was going to be ready to write checks on 1 July.
Yeah.
We've got to be, we don't want to be having this conversation at the end of March in 2026 with a couple of months left to spend the first round of funding. But at the same time, we need to take our time to get it right, and then look to be administering it. It also needs to sit alongside all the existing funds and other things, so we don't create a bottleneck. We're talking about keeping the overall process as straightforward and as simple as we can. So I guess if you are having conversations with groups, the message from me is manage expectations. We're not going to be writing checks on 1 July, but we will work to have it up and running so we can administer it as early in the year as we can.
Great.
Yes, it only comes into existence from 1st of July. It's not going to be,
And the other part
That's how I
of
understood
that,
it.
though, is for my mind, is at these scales, and especially getting up to 500,000, is having milestones in that project. And that's where I think an EOA followed by an application or program would be really helpful. But yeah, we've got quite a long way before we get to that stage, and that's great. January, I think, is when you're looking at next.
Probably not. I think it'll be February.
February, okay.
It's
sorry.
absolutely not. There will be nothing in January.
No, it's not.
So
Thank
it'll
you.
be February.
Brian would be delighted to hear that.
I just had a thought as well on the definition, as we could bring some options based on the feedback we've got today around what large scale could be to.
No, if it helps, I think we've got a really engaged council at the moment, and if that could be done sooner to assist you defining some of that stuff, feel free to do it by doodle poll or by email. And that I think would be really helpful. That's the big question.
Please fill it in.
For those, okay, there is a gift for everyone who fills it in. Anyway, And maybe chocolate fish, maybe something else.
The gift is.
There's very few chocolate fish being.
So
Yeah,
the last thing I was just gonna say, when you raised the question about the LTP and clear on what was consulted, we've gone back through the paperwork, and I think from memory, the wording was something like large scale initiatives across multiple environmental domains.
yeah.
I think, so it's very broad, and that's obviously where the challenge comes in defining that in more detail, so.
The applications will all fit.
I think what Kate was saying is in the submission process,
Mm.
we had a significant number of submissions in support of, there were a lot that was sort of more in the tick box category, but there were also a lot of written submissions that outlined why they supported us making this investment. So it's probably more that which Libby can get
Yeah.
access through Mike,
Yeah.
as opposed to what we said in our submission document.
Yeah, and certainly, but we listened to that and supported it because of that. We've got,
That was that there.
oh, that's the one there, sorry. Okay, is there anything else you need from us?
No, just thank you everyone for your very great participation and really good feedback to help us design this complex
I
process.
said to Libby the other day, and everyone's this morning, my very first experience in 1 week into law practice was to sit and take notes of a trust giving away money, and I was told in no uncertain terms by a senior lawyer in the firm, this is the hardest job you have, giving away other people's money and doing it well. And I really appreciate everyone really thinking hard about this, because this is taking someone's money out of their pocket and giving it to someone else. It is the highest responsibility we have doing in many ways. So really appreciate all the input and thinking. And is everyone happy to do it? I mean, I would rather deal with this sooner than later on the definition.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's really, for those sitting in here, quite topical now rather than dealing with this in February. And I think it might make your job easier if we deal with that sooner. Yeah. Great, thank you. I'm just going to say a special note to the chair, CEO today. Thank you, because I know it's been a pretty big day for you. Like, you can go put your feet up now. But thank you for your input. The closing of the karakia, kia te rangi Māori ki runga in ngā iwi o te ao. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Gary.
See you all tomorrow at the Hubbard
Thank you.
Theatre. Those Emma and Marina, thanks very, very much. Thanks, Libby. Good stuff.
You know what I mean?
Thank you, Kate.
I think I'm not big of a-
Yeah, no, there's some